late Romantics. These poets wrote from 1810s to 1837, after which the Victorian age began to take over. Noteworthy poets include Byron, Shelley, and Keats. I will be talking about all of them in this lecture, starting with Lord Byron. Byron's philosophy centered on personal freedom, defiance of authority, and the power of the individual. He created the archetypical Byronic hero, who was a dark, brooding, and passionate figure who rejects societal norms and follows his own path. Characters like Childe Harold from Childe Harold's Pilgrimage and Manfred from Manfred embody this rebellious spirit. They are often cursed by their past, haunted by guilt, and yet refuse to submit to fate or morality. Byron's own life mirrored his philosophy of the Byronic hero. He saw society as corrupt and restrictive, forcing individuals into artificial roles. In Don Juan, he mocks the moral pretensions of the aristocracy, exposing their duplicity. He believed in the pursuit of pleasure and experience, valuing passion over duty. So therefore, his Byronic hero became an exile, a wanderer, or an outcast who would challenge this authority, reflecting his belief that true greatness lies outside the boundaries of conventional society. Byron was also deeply political, supporting liberal revolutions in the fight for freedom. He famously wrote, "I wish men to be free as much from mobs as kings," showing his distrust of both monarchy and mob rule. He actively participated in the Greek War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire, dying in the struggle. Therefore, a poet is a rebel challenging society for Byron, and poetry is a means to do that, to challenge the society, to go against convention. Nature in Byron's work, therefore, would always be wild, untamed, and reflective of human emotion. Unlike Wordsworth, who saw nature as a gentle guide, a teacher, unlike Coleridge, who saw that as supernatural, and unlike Blake, who saw nature as mystical, Byron would see nature as a rebel, a force of chaos and power, mirroring the turbulence of his character's mind. Now let us talk about Percy Bysshe Shelley. Shelley was the most idealistic and radical of the Romantics, believing in political and social revolution as a means to achieve human progress. In The Mask of Anarchy, he calls for non-violent resistance against tyranny, making him a forerunner of modern political activism. He saw the poet as a prophet, someone who could just inspire change through visionary writing. His famous essay, A Defense in Poetry, declares that poets are unacknowledged legislators of the world, highlighting his belief in the transformative power of art and poetry. So for him, poet is somebody who could inspire a change, and poetry is something that has a transformative power on the society. Poetry was that struggle between oppression and liberty. Now I call him idealistic and radical because of the content of his poetry and the way in which he looked at poetry. In his The Necessity for Atheism, he argued that blind faith in religion was oppressive. However, he was not entirely without spirituality. His works reflect a pantheistic belief in a divine force present in nature and human thought. In Mont Blanc, he describes nature as an eternal power, indifferent to human suffering, yet a source of inspiration. He saw the sublime, that is the overwhelming vastness of nature, as a reflection of the limitless potential of human imagination. You will also see him projecting figures of resistance against tyranny. For example, his work Prometheus Unbound, where he rewrites the myth of Prometheus, portraying him as someone who would go against oppressive governments and religious institutions. Unlike in Aeschylus, where Prometheus is ultimately reconciled with Zeus, Shelley's Prometheus is completely triumphant, representing Shelley's faith in humanity's power to overcome injustice. If you look at one similarity between Keats and Shelley, we will see that in their definition of love and beauty. Unlike Keats, who focused on sensory experience of beauty, Shelley saw love and beauty as an intellectual and spiritual force. In his Epipsychidion, he explores the idea of the ideal soulmate, suggesting that earthly love is only a reflection of a higher, unattainable ideal. This aligns with Platonism, which heavily influenced his thinking. He believed that the material world was merely a shadow of a more perfect, transcendental reality, just as Plato believed in it. Now let's come to Keats. As I've mentioned, both him and Shelley believed in the idea of love and beauty as central to their poetry. That is the reason why he gave the idea of transcendental beauty, a concept where beauty is not just an aesthetic quality, but an ideal or absolute form that surpasses material existence, often linked to truth. For him, beauty is the highest form of truth, as famously stated in his Ode on a Grecian Urn, beauty is truth, truth beauty. Unlike Shelley or Byron, who were the later romantics whose poetry was heavily influenced by politics and political change, Keats was a later romantic who believed in art for art's sake. So for him, poetry should exist purely to capture beauty, without needing a moral or a philosophical purpose. And therefore his sensory-rich descriptions create an immersive world, allowing the reader to experience beauty through sight, touch, taste, and sound. A poet to him has two qualities. First is the quality of negative capability. Keats describes negative capability as the ability to accept uncertainty and mystery without trying to rationalize everything. It is the ability to remain in doubt without the need for rational explanation. Poetry should not seek to explain everything rationally, but should capture beauty, emotion, and experience in their purest forms. Unlike Coleridge, who sought to explain the supernatural, Keats embraced ambiguity and paradox. He saw the world as a place of contradictions, joy and sorrow, love and loss, beauty and decay. And therefore he believed that poetry should reflect this complexity without forcing resolution. This idea is evident in his Ode on Melancholy, where he suggests that pleasure and pain are inseparable. And all great poets, especially Shakespeare, possess this quality, allowing them to embrace ambiguity. He contrasts this with a more rigid, logical approach, which he associates with figures like Coleridge, who always sought definitive answers. Another feature of a poet to Keats was described in his letter to Richard Woodhouse, where he describes the poet as a chameleon, meaning that a true poet has no fixed personality but absorbs and reflects the world around them. Unlike philosophers or moralists who impose their own views, the poet merges with their subject and expresses multiple perspectives. This aligns with his earlier concept of negative capability and also gives rise to a newer concept, egoistical sublime. Egoistical sublime was a concept given by Keats to criticize poets, notably Wordsworth. Wordsworth's The Prelude focuses on his personal experiences with nature and how they shape his poetic soul. Keats criticized this. He preferred poets like Shakespeare, who immerse themselves in universal emotions rather than their own ego. So egoistical sublime is a perceived self-centeredness in the poetry of William Wordsworth, where the poet's narrative voice conveys a singular, often self-absorbed truth. Contrasting to that, he had the idea of the poet as a chameleon, where the poet is a vessel for experience rather than a moral instructor with his own personal views and experiences. These ideas have profoundly influenced later literary movement, especially modernism. Over the course of my introduction on Romanticism, you may have noticed one key aspect of the Romantic movement. It emphasizes the importance of individual feelings, emotions, and experiences over objective reality and reason. This is known as romantic subjectivism. Romanticism is known for its turn to subjectivism, the impulse to look for truth inwards. Dr. Philip Irving Mitchell talks about three major writers during this period. Rousseau, a French philosopher who heavily influenced Romanticism; Wordsworth, an early Romantic; and Keats, a late Romantic. He believes that all of them show the same subjective inward turn in differing but overlapping ways. You can find his lecture on this over here. But to summarize what he talks about in this lecture, he believes that Rousseau relies on his imagination's ability to shape his experience of nature. Confession is important because the human self is at the center of creating truth. Both Rousseau and Augustine wrote confessions, but their purposes and perspectives differ significantly. Augustine's work is a religious and theological exploration of his life. He confesses a sin and glorifies God, seeking forgiveness and understanding of divine grace. He sees humanity as inherently flawed and in need of God's grace, emphasizing the concept of the original sin. Rousseau, on the other hand, has given a very secular philosophical examination of his experiences. His purpose is to present a unique and honest account of his life, explore his character, and defend his philosophical ideas, particularly his concept of natural goodness and the corrupting influence of society. He believes in the inherent goodness of humanity, arguing that society corrupts individuals, and humans are naturally free and equal. I talk more about Rousseau in my lecture on sentimentalism, which you can find here. For Rousseau, the real power by which one experiences the world is the imagination's ability to alter and refine one's experience. The same idea is further developed in Wordsworth, who holds that one must look inward to the way that past experiences are reshaped or associated anew in the memory, which he refers to as emotions recollected in tranquility. This is why Wordsworth praises the mind as a mansion for all lovely forms, and memory as a dwelling place for all sweet sounds and harmony. Keats builds on these ideas in a slightly different way. Like Rousseau and Wordsworth, he holds that truth is essentially subjective. He agrees with Wordsworth that poetry is an expression of emotion in regard to an object or experience. In fact, Keats' concept of the negative capability is entirely based on having a subjective experience and not using reason and logic to fraction out your life. So you can notice how for each thinker, one's perception of the outside world is shaped by an inward reconfiguration or sense of subjective truth. This was all about the later Romantics. Romanticism ran across the entire Regency period and was followed by Positivism movement. You can know more about the Positivist movement in this lecture.